As you've just heard, my name's Derek Taylor. I'm the Secretary of the Edinburgh Bibliographical Society. But my job this evening is to introduce our speaker and to host the rest of the session. Before I do, I'd like to extend a special welcome to those who are joining us as guests tonight. You may not be aware, those who are not members, that we are the oldest bibliographical society in the world, and we're very proud of that. We were founded in 1890. And in addition to our annual programme of 9 talks, of which this evening is one, we publish each year a journal which contains learned articles on a variety of topics relevant to Scottish bibliography. And if you are a member of our society, you get access to all our talks and you get a copy of the journal for the princely sum of £18 a year, which is an absolute bargain. So yes, this is an unveiled attempt to get you to join us. We'd love to have you as members of our society. And if you would like to follow it up, please go to our website, www.edbibsoc.org, and you'll find the contact details there, and we'll help you to join. But turning to the main event of the evening, it's my very great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Joseph Marshall. Now, at this point in proceedings like this, the chairperson usually says, so-and-so needs no introduction. On this occasion, that is absolutely true, because Joe has actually been a member of the Society for a good few years now, so he's known to all our members, and he's been a very active member of the Society. He's served in a variety of capacities. He's been on the chair, he was on the committee for many years. He was treasurer for a while. He edited our journal to great effect for a good few years. And he preceded Elizabeth as president for a 6-year period and performed that role with great distinction. Joe did his doctorate in Edinburgh in the mid-90s, followed by a couple of spells at the National Library of Scotland. The first was as curator of rare books, and latterly, in fact, his current role is back at the NLS, where he's associate director of collections management, which I assume University Library here in Edinburgh. And he takes as his title tonight, The Special Collections of the Future. And it's difficult to think of a topic that could be more relevant to a society like ours. And it's even more impossible to think of anyone who would be more suited to share his thoughts on it with us than Joe. One quick reminder before I pass over to him: if you want at any point to raise any observation on anything Joe says, or you want to ask a question, please do it through the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It's in the middle there, roughly, and we'll get through as many of those at the end as we can. So, Joe, over to you.
Thank you very much, Derek, and it's great to be back at EBS. It's lovely to see you all again. So, as Derek was saying, I'm Associate Director of Collections Management at the National Library of Scotland. In a previous role, I was Head of Special Collections at the University of Edinburgh, and really pleased to be talking to you today about the special collections of the future. So this has been an interesting day for me. I've just come from hosting a conference where I was giving a paper on the new strategy of the National Library of Scotland, accompanied by many PowerPoint slides. And you're not getting any slides tonight. I'm just going to talk. So it's quite interesting. That was one way of looking at the future. I'm going to give you an entirely different way of looking at the future just now. But I stand by both of them. Okay. So, the future of special collections and the special collections of the future. Well, first of all, a word about terminology. So all the terminology here is fraught with contested meaning. I'll say a little bit about definitions, but to reassure you, this is not going to be a theory-heavy paper. What this is a personal reflection from what I suppose is a mid-career perspective, from my background as a user of special collections, as a rare books librarian, and as a manager of collections. And at the National Library of Scotland, of course, it's all special. I'll here add the usual disclaimer that these are my own views. They are not the position of the National Library of Scotland or any other organisation for which I may have worked. However, these views obviously spring from my day job, which is in large part to plan for the future, both in terms of avoiding disasters, and more positively in trying to anticipate what they will look like in 10, 50 or 500 years from now. So what I'd like to do today is to provoke a few reactions. I hope this is a subject that you all care about, and this is about the value and the present and the future of the collections which are the raw material of bibliography. So I hope it will be interesting to library colleagues, but also I hope it will be interesting to those of you who are users of special collections, whether students or scholars or teachers, and who might like to have some sense of how these libraries are going to change over the next few years. So before we get into the librarianship stuff, I'd like to start with an extract from fiction, which for me captures quite a lot of the emotion and excitement that some of us feel when we think about the future of special collections. So this is a quotation from Richard Jefferies' novel After London, published in 1885. And this is an early post-apocalypse novel imagining a near future in which society has reverted to a medieval existence. And Jefferies writes extensively about the fate of our books. He says, "When the ancients departed, the modern books which they had composed, being left in the decaying houses at the mercy of the weather, rotted or were destroyed by the frequent fires. But those that had been preserved by the ancients in museums escaped for a while, and some of these yet remained in lumber rooms and corners, whence they were occasionally dragged forth by the servants for greater convenience in lighting the fires." And then in another passage, he says, "Yet some of the far more ancient Greek and Roman classics remained because they contained depth and originality of ideas in small compass. They had been copied in manuscripts by thoughtful men from the old printed books before they mouldered away, and their manuscripts being copied again, these works were handed down. The books which came into existence with printing had never been copied by the pen and had consequently nearly disappeared. Extremely long and diffuse it was found too, that so many of them were but enlargements of ideas or sentiments which had been expressed in a few words by the classics. It is so much easier to copy an epigram of 2 lines than a printed book of hundreds of pages. And hence it was that Sophocles had survived, while much more recent writers had been lost." So for me, this is full of thrills. This is absolutely why I became a special collections librarian in the first place. So let's pull out a few threads, and I'm sure you'll all think of other parallels in life or fiction. First of all, we have the sense of delicious peril. Objects which contain the story of the past and perhaps the key to the future are at risk of utter destruction. Water, fire, and mold are just waiting for their opportunity once human neglect and stupidity let them in. And then there is the activity of rescue against the odds, preservation in a museum, copying by hand. You can see the scribe sitting in his booth. Jefferies talks quite a bit about printing, and in his imagined future, the technology is still known and understood, but there is a preference for manuscript production. And as we go through this paper, I want to say that I think the future of special collections is intimately related both to the future of technology and to the future of our culture. A third strand I'd put out from this extract is the question of selection. How do we decide what survives, what is collected and what is passed on? And the idea articulated by Jefferies here is that our older written heritage is much more likely to survive. I think many of us who have handled incunabula and other robust early printed books know instinctively that a book which has survived for 500 years is much more likely to last another 500 than a modern paperback. Here is a truly horrible object, which you might like to see. So this is a copy of John Knox's History of the Reformation, printed in Edinburgh in 1731. It has been very, very well used. The paper is so brown from use that it looks as though somebody has almost painted it with tea, trying to make it look old. But it is still almost indestructible, despite hundreds of years, extensive use. This is going to last pretty much forever. Whereas, take a modern paperback, such as another post-apocalypse novel, Earth Abides, this is not going to last because it is not made of materials that are intended to survive. So there's also the sharp observation that the scale and prolixity of modern book production makes it difficult to see how future generations can prioritize and choose if they have to decide what should be preserved. So if we lost our technology, it would still be possible for a scribe to copy a short text like Sophocles' Antigone, say, It's less easy to imagine the text of Ulysses, for example, being transmitted in the same way. And given the vast scale of modern publishing, there's a broader question about how future generations will be able to make any sense of our output, even if it is actively preserved. And with all of this, there's the unvoiced assumption that there is a privileged onlooker, someone who looks on the last copy of a book as something more than convenient tinder. So who is this person who takes all these anxieties to heart and intervenes, perhaps going against the grain of their society in doing so? So let's call him or her a librarian, perhaps a special collections librarian. So for me, special collections librarianship is rooted in anxiety. And this is reflected in a swathe of books and articles over the last 30 years, all worrying about the future of special collections. So I won't go through the bibliography of these, but an important example is Daniel Trace's article of 1993 entitled, "Is there a future for special collections, and should there be?" And there's much more of that sort. So over the next half hour, I'd like to look at whether these anxieties and aspirations are related to real trends in the library world, or whether they're just part of the librarian's self-imagining. So where are we really going? So now we get into the definitions. Well, what are special collections, and why are people worried or excited about their future, and why should we care? Well, let's start as we always do with Wikipedia. So Wikipedia tells us in library science, special collections are libraries or library units that house materials requiring specialized security and user services. Materials housed in special collections can be in any format, including rare books, manuscripts, photographs, archives, ephemera, and digital records, and are generally characterized by their artifactual or monetary value, physical format uniqueness or rarity, and or an institutional commitment to long-term preservation and access. They can also include association with important figures. Individual libraries determine for themselves what constitute their own special collections, resulting in a somewhat mutable definition. So I would actually like to know when the phrase special collections was first used, and I'd be appreciative if anybody knows anything about this. I know that if you go back into the 18th century, the early 19th century, people used the word antiquities and antiquarian. And of course, people had concepts of items which were rare or important. But I can't find that there was any clear distinction between special and general collections in a library setting until the late 19th century. And perhaps this is simply because access to any items was generally heavily restricted in a library compared to modern approaches. So I did find one article in Notes and Queries in 1876 by the wonderfully named J.P. Earwaker, which is headed Special Collections and Special Collectors. And I think this may be one of the earliest uses of the phrase in something approaching the modern sense. So J.P. Earwaker writes, "A paragraph in Professor Mayer's recent article advocating the collecting of local books, pamphlets, etc., has revived an idea that I have often thought of mentioning in the columns of Notes and Queries. That is, to suggest the placing on record of the names of those public and private libraries where any special class of books is being collected. The publication of such a list would not only be of great value to those principally concerned, but would also be of public utility, as it would afford a means of preserving books, pamphlets, sermons, etc., which, whilst of little use to one person, might fill up lacunae in the collection of another. For example, the Birmingham Library some years ago began to make a speciality of Shakespeareana, and having made this generally known, it is now one of the finest collections of books relating to Shakespeare that can be well imagined." So this picks up a few key themes, the themes of the collection development, preservation, institutional cooperation, sharing of information, and of course, user benefits. And it's my impression that it's about this time in the 1870s that libraries started to think about some classes of material as being more special than others, and separating them out from general teaching or lending collections. By the mid to late 20th century, the default position was that most serious research libraries in the UK and North America had a special collections section or department of some kind. Sometimes these included collections of archives and manuscripts, sometimes they were primarily holdings of rare books. So I'm going to use the term special collections in the broadest sense as per Wikipedia, both to refer to the stuff, the accumulations of material, but also to the organisational arrangements for managing the stuff, and indeed the people who do that work. So at the moment, most major research libraries in the UK have either a special collections department or something with a different name, but basically doing the same job. And generally, these departments are staffed by either librarians or archivists, trying to rub along as best they can together. So let's bring this down to a local level, and I'm going to try and make this a bit interactive at this point. So how many libraries in Edinburgh do you think there are which have or which contain special collections? So I'd like you to have a think about that and put your numbers in the chats, and be really interested to see what people think. I see Daryl's already made a suggestion. Yeah, so keep it going, keep it going. We've got 15, 9, 25, 20. Okay, keep thinking. Graham Hawley says 22. Right, well, I'm going to start reading through a list. So you of the ones I know about, and I bet you I don't know them all. So obviously we've got the National Library of Scotland. We've got Edinburgh University Library. And of course, within the university, we have New College Library, Scottish Studies Library, Edinburgh College of Art. We've got the Advocates Library, the Signet Library, the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh, the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, the Royal Medical Society has a small but very fine collection, the Royal Observatory of Edinburgh, the Edinburgh Room of the City Library, the Royal Botanic Gardens of Edinburgh, the National Records of Scotland with their fine library, the Scottish Parliament with the Donald Dewar collection, the Theosophical Society. I wonder how many of you have been into the Theosophical Society. The Scottish Poetry Library, Napier University with its fantastic Clark collection of typography, Heriot Watt and Queen Margaret Universities with their special collections, the National Galleries of Scotland, National Museums of Scotland, the Scottish Portrait Gallery, of course, within the galleries, the Gladstone Memorial Library in Debenhams. I don't know how many of you are aware of that. If you walk through the underwear department, you will find it with 18th century books sitting there and next to the knickers. Freemasons Hall, the Speculative Society, housed in Old College in Edinburgh, still without electric light, in a defiant rebuke to the 21st century. The Scottish Catholic Archives. So I'm going to stop there. We have got well over 30 special collections just within the city of Edinburgh. So, and you might ask yourself, is this viable long term? Where is all this going? But I think it does suggest that this is a very suitable topic for a paper at the Edinburgh Bibliographical Society. So where are these special collections right now? So here are a few observations. So first, a couple of general comments and then some more specifics. So the first comment is that special collections have been through a period of extraordinary change in the last 30 years. And I've been through this personally. I started out as a librarian in the year 2000, working on the old card catalogue at the National Library of Scotland. Occasionally, you would enter combat with a microfilm reader, but the most exciting technological experience was when I got to borrow the library's mobile phone, note the singular, in order to go to the Olympia Book Fair in London. So from a modern student's perspective, I am ancient. I've grown up in a non-digital world which no longer exists. And I can play, I use Twitter, I download books on the Kindle app, I can talk plausibly about digital files and coding as long as there are no real techies in the room. But I belong to that previous world. I prefer to read from a physical codex. I write in ink on paper. So that has been a huge change for special collections. But they have come through this period in relatively good shape. And this is my second general comment. Special collections are ruthlessly good at surviving. Within the UK, at least, special collections have in many cases done well. There have been very few catastrophic losses, a few thefts. A couple of significant deposited collections have been dispersed, notably the Hesketh collection at the University of Lancaster and the Mendham collection at the University of Kent, but no ruinous fires, no department closures, certainly not in recent years. And institutions must have been hugely tempted to realise their special collections as financial assets, particularly during the years of austerity. But instead, they've leveraged their prestige and their unique attractions. In fact, we've seen a rash of new landmark buildings to house collections, particularly in the university sector. So I think it could well be the case that we look back on the first 2 decades of this century as a golden era for special collections, even though it might not have felt that way from the inside at the time. And in Scotland, I think that's particularly true, as we benefit from what I think is a genuine phenomenon, often exaggerated, but nonetheless real, that overall Scotland does place a higher value on cultural heritage than some other parts of the UK. And we could no doubt debate that one. And then some more specific observations. So, where are we right now? Well, The first is that the profile of special collections has held up, and the media just love the curator slipping on the white gloves and any fatuous story about things being discovered hidden in the dusty vaults. Think about the number of novels which have rare volumes or mysterious manuscripts at their heart. Even if we discount the drivel of Dan Brown, think about Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose with its monastic library holding the last copy of Aristotle's Comedy, or Geraldine Brooks's wonderful People of the Book on the repeated rescues of the Sarajevo Haggadah. The protagonist of Audrey Niffenegger's popular but, to my mind, creepy The Time Traveller's Wife is actually a special collections librarian. And then think of the movies, The Day After Tomorrow with the librarian at the New York Public Library. People just love this stuff. Second observation is that special collections have in many cases expanded their physical footprint substantially over the last 50 years. No one can quite match the achievement of the Thomas Fisher Library in Toronto, whose legendary librarian Richard Landon grew the collection from 45,000 to over 700,000 books in the course of his tenure. And purchase funds, however, have generally recovered after the cuts in the 1990s and early 2000s. And growth has also been powered by donations, particularly as people who were able to collect cheaply in the 20th century clear out their attics. But also, and this is really important, through archivists and librarians building relationships with living writers and thinkers. And special collections, certainly in higher education, have also been the recipients of older books being moved out of general lending and teaching collections. So there has been real growth, and the new landmark buildings like at Lambeth Palace, they're mostly genuinely required to meet expansion needs. Third observation is that we're actually understanding far more about collections now than ever before. This is partly because we're continuing to map our understanding as more material gets catalogued online. So there are still large unlisted printed collections. For example, the great treasure that is the printed papers of the Scottish Court of Session, held in Edinburgh by the Signets, Advocates and University Libraries. But these large unlisted collections are being whittled down. I think it was a bit previous of the English short title catalogue to talk about the Endgame project in the 1990s, but I think now we're getting pretty close to the point where we have a comprehensive inventory of material printed in the British Isles or in any of our native languages before 1800. There are now also good systems for the recording of archival catalogue descriptions online, which are starting to make a real difference to our understanding of and access to these collections. We're also benefiting from research, whether it's into provenances or printing manufacture or textual transmission. There are some really exciting applications of science towards special collections, and particularly in the field of conservation. For example, there is now the ability to analyse the DNA of vellum, so you can tell exactly what species of animal was sacrificed to make a manuscript, where it lived and when it was turned into parchment. You can also analyse books using a range of spectral imaging techniques, all of which can provide new information about the composition and origins of special collections objects. And I think the field of scientific conservation is one that's really going to expand over the next few years. Fourth observation, and this is that technological change has generally been pretty positive as far as special collections are concerned. As yet, there's no sense that special collections work can be done by robots or artificial intelligence, although there are some interesting developments to speed up the creation of catalogue records. Instead, there's a general sense that technology can be brought to bear on special collections objects to make books and manuscripts more widely accessible than ever before. Special collections libraries were pioneers in digitisation. They continue to digitise their content, often giving it away freely for anyone to use and enjoy. Unfortunately, the story in archives is often rather different, with both national and local records relying on commercial partnerships to digitise public records, which are then only available at a price. So libraries have digitisation programmes. They find they can now reach thousands or millions of users rather than just a few hundred annual reading room visitors. And sometimes these digitisation programmes have led to a decline in the number of in-person visits. This is certainly true, for instance, with our own digitisation programme of maps at the National Library of Scotland. However, in other cases, they have led to renewed interest and heightened awareness, which actually sucks more people in. So my personal example here would be the 14th century Rashid al-Din manuscript at the University of Edinburgh, which is fully digitised online, including its famous illustrations of the Prophet Muhammad. And this attracts a wide range of in-person visitors, tourists, art historians, Persian scholars, sometimes an unwelcome interest as well, but we'll say more of that another time. And then the fifth And final observation is about where we are now is that special collections librarians are much more engaged than ever before with their own organisation, with their sectoral peers, and above all with their users. And most special collections leaders I know work really hard for their position. They don't take their existence for granted, they work to show value. In many cases, special collections have come together with art or museum collections, and this brings great advantages in terms of things like exhibitions or joint events. And this was a key factor in the creation of the Centre for Research Collections at the University of Edinburgh. At the University of Reading, they've brought their fantastic publishing special collections together with the Museum of English Rural Life. Not the most obvious synergy you might think, but in terms of practical benefits, it's an amazing success story. And the Museum of English Rural Life is also one of the leaders in the use of social media to engage people. And I must admit, this is an area where I was initially pretty skeptical, but now I can see the impact that Twitter and Instagram can have in getting collections into places you might have thought unreachable. And special collections are also really good at making their collections available for research and teaching, expanding their reach. All this does present some challenges for future preservation. So collections now maybe getting more use in a year than they've had in all the previous centuries of their existence. However, I genuinely believe that people are the reason we have collections. And given that organic materials don't last forever, no matter what we do need overall to prioritise the benefits of access. So one question I have, I mean, you might say, come to this at the end, is whether these changes over these last 30 years have disadvantaged the traditional scholar in some ways. I think a lot has been gained, but I also have a feeling that some things have been lost as well, whether that's access to a scholar librarian who knows the collection really well, or the reduction in browsing access, or simply the new web-based catalogues with their infinite multiplication of digital resources. So to wrap up where we are now, I think special collections are in a reasonably good place. There's still plenty of challenges around resourcing, and no doubt we'll always worry about the future, but I think they've managed a good trick. They're continuing to build up collections, and they've also shifted the focus into what they do with those collections. So maybe some of the anxiety we spoke about at the start of it's misplaced, or perhaps it's because of those eloquently expressed concerns that special collections have positioned themselves so successfully. So in the final 10 minutes or so, I'd like to offer a few rash predictions on the basis of these trends we've just been talking about. Generally, I think there'll be more of the same. There'll be more of the shift to the digital, but I also predict more disruption as well as continuity. So here are my predictions, and I hope these will provoke a few reactions. So first of all, the name is going to remain problematic and contentious. The word special is loaded. It implies both selective discrimination and a hierarchy of collections, but it won't go away because really nobody's found anything better. Research Libraries UK have come up with what I think is a truly awful phrase, unique and distinctive collections, which I think is incredibly pompous. Other people have tried heritage collections, which just makes me think of souvenir tea towels and cream teas, or historic collections, but then you sideline modern literary archives, private press books, born digital collections. So we're not going to resolve this one anytime soon. Secondly, there's going to be significant continuity. Special collections are going to keep going. There'll still be large collections of rare books, manuscripts, archives, and objects. They just aren't easily dumped. But there is going to be some real change. And I think there are three big drivers for change. And those drivers are around technology, organizations, and society. So first of all, technology. Well, technology is obviously a key driver for special collections. And the question is really how far we're going to be driven. The main trends are around the ongoing releasing of access to collections through online descriptions and digital images, and then doing stuff with that content. And COVID-19 has only accelerated that digital shift. So we've got well beyond the point when digitization is just about sticking up a few digital photographs. We can now present online images accompanied by searchable transcribed text, tools for comparison with related books, and all sorts of other contextual information. I predict that one of the next big things will be the ability to convert large volumes of digitized manuscript into machine-readable text. The technology is nearly there, and that will be a game changer. And I think this may result in a levelling out between the worlds of rare books and archives. I think it's fair to say that rare books have been victims of their own success in going down the digitization route. Now that there's so much collaborative cataloguing and digitisation, a large and growing proportion of rare books are accessible without having to travel to one specific institution. And the reality is that the bulk of most printed special collections libraries consists of 18th and 19th century books which will now never be opened again because the contents are available online. When products like Early English Books Online started to arrive in the early 2000s, we rare books librarians consoled ourselves with the thought that researchers would increasingly turn to copy-specific information, bindings, provenance, marginalia, but it didn't really happen at any scale. The number of people interested in such things is important, but pretty small. And all the evidence indicates that most people who use special collections are looking for information in the contents. And if they can find it online, that's generally what they prefer. With archives and manuscripts, they generally can't yet, so those collections have been getting the larger share of in-person physical usage in recent years. But I suspect that's going to change, and with all the resource implications that come with that. The overall trend points to a reduction in the number of people who come into a reading room to read, perhaps compensated by these collections being opened up to worldwide audiences of millions. I say perhaps because I think we still don't really know how to compare the value of an in-person encounter with a rare book to landing on a digitized page via Google. But there's also the big story of collections that are born digital, whether that's a writer's emails and computer files being added to an archive, or the flood of material that's published as digital journals or e-books. Some of these digital objects are highly complex and challenging to preserve. So we've got multimedia books with virtual reality, with gaming elements. Much of this material doesn't yet formally fall within the remit of most special collections, but it's coming your way. At the National Library of Scotland, we have shared responsibility for the UK Web Archive, through which the UK web domain is harvested under legal deposit legislation. And this collection amounts to some 10 million websites, around 700 terabytes of data. How on earth are we going to catalogue it, make it available, interpret it? Can we exhibit it? We've only really just begun to ask those questions. If you're interested in digital publishing, I'd strongly recommend an article by Matthew Kirschenbaum called Books, Files, Preservation of Digital Assets in the Contemporary Publishing Industry. Published in 2020, this article shows just how incredibly complex the systems and layers of technology are involved in producing a book in 2021. Starting from an author's digital manuscript to editing, dissemination through Amazon, it's incredibly complex. And Kirschenbaum gives a fascinating example of the textual transmission of David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas and how there are different iterations in the different digital versions. And you can really only understand this if you understand the model of digital production. Do we as librarians or scholars have the tools to engage with this content and understand its bibliography? The answer to that is probably no, not yet, but we're going to need them in the near future. There are loads of other exciting technologies which will impact on special collections. One that particularly fascinates me is the possible use of DNA as a storage vehicle for information content. So I think you could get the entire written corpus of humanity into a test tube if you use DNA as the means to encode the information. The problem at the moment is how you get the data back out again. So that's enough on technology, which I do think is a key driver. But then even more important is the human context, the people in the organisations which run and staff special collections departments. So where are these institutions going? Well, higher education, which manages most UK research libraries, is going through an endless series of crises, particularly at the moment after the double whammy of COVID and Brexit. And other smaller and specialist libraries are also feeling the squeeze. You'll all be aware of what's happening at the Victoria and Albert Museum and the threat to the great library there. And I predict that there will be many more institutional mergers with consequent aggregation of collections. And we've sort of seen this in Edinburgh in 2010 with the merger between the university and Edinburgh College of Art, which I think was actually extremely positive for the collections because those collections at Edinburgh College of Art finally got the injection of resource and attention they deserved. So this process of rationalisation will lead to disposals and transfers. To use another local example, the University of Edinburgh decided some years ago that it made no sense to maintain its own specialist map library, while the National Library of Scotland had a dedicated map library 5 minutes walk away. So there's going to be convergence, there will be expansion for some collections, but I think conversely, there will also be a sense of focus on the high impact of a small core collection. The days when libraries were judged on their size are gone. Now that so much is available online, having large runs of non-rare published material is a bit of a pain more than anything. Thinking about my previous job at the University of Edinburgh, I would say that the collection with the highest overall impact there was the Western Medieval Manuscripts, a collection of under 300 volumes out of a total holding of around 400,000 special collections books. A small collection that's unique, coherent, meets multiple user needs with interesting research challenges, and which has characteristics which can't easily be captured through digitization. It's likely to be a stronger collection than a large general library. For universities, having a strong special collection, however small, is likely to be a key mark of differentiation in the future. With digital publication and digitization, most general teaching and lending collections are going to be largely identical going forwards. Information seekers will start their journeys with the big aggregators, with Google, Wikipedia, Amazon. And one of the key challenges for special collections libraries will be how can they use and develop their collection to make their organization distinctive? And in order to do this, they're going to need special collections staff with an extraordinary range of skills, which is an entirely separate discussion. And then the final driver, society. What about the wider society in which all this happens? So we could spend a long time on the subject of how special collections are responding to current social trends. Traditionally, there has been a long lag in special collections representing their society. That may no longer be the case when these collections are digital online. Theoretically, we can capture the mood of the moment as it passes. If anything, we now face an opposite danger that special collections may be too accommodating to the mood of the times. We have a society at the moment which is fascinated, even obsessed with the past. And you can see this in the history books, the documentaries, the debates on social media. People are constantly looking to find new evidence, to re-examine, to reread, reinterpret. However, I would say there's a certain cultural aversion to applying these same critical methodologies to look at the present. We love to call the past to account, to find examples of injustice and error, as well as the golden thread of people whose ideas were more in accordance with our own. And this can lead to a simplistic story of societal progress, which isn't really supported by the actual historical record or the story of the collections. I think archival collections are particularly vulnerable to being used in this way to tell oversimple stories. Given the range and detail of archives, you can always find the story you're looking for if you try hard enough. You just have to read selectively. And that's not a criticism in itself. Given the mass of family, business, literary papers, you have to approach in a selective way. However, this is less easy when it comes to rare books. Here you're dealing with information objects which have already been selected, whether by their own historical context or by later collectors or libraries. You can look at a splendid example of printing, say the Gutenberg Bible or the Kelmscott Chaucer, and it is not necessarily amenable to the preoccupations of the present. These things stand confidently and stare back at us. And I do wonder whether some of this is the reason why over the last 20 years, archives have generally received stronger resourcing than rare books. Again, maybe one for further discussion. I think part of the anxiety about the future of special collections we mentioned at the start stems from the feeling that they don't fit in. And actually, I hope they never do fully fit in. Special collections should be a constant source of critique and challenge to the present as well as the past. When I was head of special collections at the University of Edinburgh, I sometimes used to think that the collections should act as the conscience of the organisation. Yes, they have to support its current mission of values, of course they do. And of course they have to engage with what's happening in society, but they also have to remind it of the long view and of how complex things generally really are. So big challenges for special collections, how you get that balance right, questioning the present but without lapsing into reactionary positions, not easy. However, I'm going to end with the big existential questions. Are we going to survive at all? So special collections are a function of a highly developed complex society. Some might say a luxury product of economic surplus, and their future is intimately related to the future of that society. So as history shows us over and over again, when society fractures or collapses, libraries and cultural collections are always casualties. Richard Ovenden's recent Burning the Books, which is a brilliant read, highly recommend it, makes that painfully clear. However, the other aspect of that is that when society starts to rebuild and recover after a crisis, its cultural memory is one of the things it turns to as a basis for that recovery. So special collections are needed more than ever in the dark times. I recommend another post-apocalypse novel, Robert Harris's Second Sleep, which describes a future society which has lost its technology, putting its story back together again from surviving manuscripts. At the moment, we seem to have a major geopolitical shock at least once a decade. So 2001, the war on terror, 2008, the banking crisis, 2020, the pandemic. On each occasion, our society has shown perhaps a surprising degree of resilience. Although if you were looking for a toilet roll in a supermarket in March last year, you might think otherwise. However, there is the sense that the scale and the intensity of these global events is increasing, and that within our lifetimes, we are likely to be tested by an event or a succession of events which compromise infrastructure and lead to long-term changes to the way we live. Climate change is an obvious candidate, but there are plenty of other contenders. So this doesn't mean we have to throw up our hands about the coming end of the world. Last year, the Institute for the Future produced a report called The Hyperconnected World of 2030 to 2040. This is a fascinating read, and it forecasts a number of different scenarios with various positions between dystopian nightmare and technological paradise, perhaps somewhere between Blade Runner and Star Trek. Many of the scenarios do involve disruptive change, more inequality, and the uneven application of technology. However, in all of them, it's possible to imagine a future for special collections. That might be a future in which collections provide a powerful source of enrichment for a thriving technological society, providing a rapidly changing world with cultural memory and its conscience. Or it might be a future in which special collections continue even after the digital lights have gone out and give a future society the building blocks to start again. Or it may be that the future of special collections is in part sorting out the intellectual and technical mess of our present. One of the projects I most admire is Katie Paterson's Future Library, which started in 2014. And this is kind of an art project. In this project, 100 writers, including big names like Margaret Atwood, have agreed to provide texts which will not be published for 100 years. They've all been locked away in a safe, and what's happened instead is that a forest has been planted in Norway that in 2114 will be harvested and turned into paper. And on that paper, these previously unseen, unread works will be printed and disseminated for the first time. That is the kind of projection into the future beyond our own lifetime horizons that for me sums up the rationale and hope of having special collections. So heading towards the conclusion, going back to Daniel Traister's article from 1993, is there a future for special collections? One of Traister's big concerns back then was that special collections represent a huge investment which only benefits a tiny number of people. We can contest that now, given the rise of digitization and online access, but his article remains influential, and it's really a plea for the balance between access and preservation to be tilted a bit more in favor of the user. And Traister makes some concluding remarks, which I quote. He says, special collections will survive. Too much has been invested in them for them not to survive. But unless we who staff them demonstrate an imaginative willingness to come to grips with this fundamental drive towards increasing openness, I, for one, will anticipate not their thriving future, but rather their increasing marginalization in the teaching and research processes they claim to support. And though they have been my career, I will be far from certain that their survival is cause for rejoicing. Oh dear. Well, I think that sounds almost comically despondent. And actually that may suggest that things have improved, perhaps rather for the better since 1993. I think special collections are in general much more open, much more friendly, much more accessible. They've changed, they've taken positive advantage of the digital shift. They still have huge challenges, some of which we've talked about just now. However, I think special collections can look into this very uncertain future with a sense of well-grounded hope that the continuities they represent will be sustained and that their future is not just one of cunning survival, but one of flourishing. Thank you very much.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Joe. That was tremendous. Absolutely fascinating. Before we hand over to questions, I'll just make a comment, if I may, using my privilege as the only one who's allowed to speak at the moment. I was fascinated particularly by all your references to post-apocalyptic novels and futures. And it reminded me of my favorite science fiction novel, A Canticle for Leibowitz, by Walter J. Miller. And in there, a whole religion and culture in the far distant future is founded on the basis.
Spoiler.
What?
Don't do a spoiler.
On the basis of a fragment of a shopping list which had survived from the 20th century. So there is hope for special collections even on the basis of a fragment of a shopping list. Right, okay, questions, here we go. What have we got? Thanks. So good to think about Jeffreys and After London. Fascinating talk. Anybody got any questions?
I've written down the title of that novel you mentioned just now, Graham, because that's one I haven't read. Derek, I shall go and read it.
A Canticle for Leibowitz. It's wonderful, right.
Thank you.
Elizabeth, actually, are you there? My chat function thing seems to have stopped working. And there may be questions I'm not seeing. Are you able to?
I haven't got any questions that I can see.
Ah.
There must be some.
Wait, if you don't mind, I'm going to interject with audio because I was trying to find the button to raise my hand, but I can't.
Oh, please do.
And so just it's more like a comment. Well, first
That's
of all,
fine.
Professor Marshall, really thank you for this. I think this is a very important moment for us, like bibliographers and biblio people, to start thinking about what our archives will look like. And well, it's not a question, it's just a provocative, I'll throw it in the field, right? And well, I don't know what the situation is in the UK, but in Europe, we have a huge problem at the moment with the possibility of making free copies of archival material for personal study. Not all libraries allow that because they think that it will be a loss. Wait, yeah, I turn on the video so you can just see me talking. Anyway, and that's the point. Are we going to make a lot of money by charging people for copies? Or are we going to make more money and possibly are we going to be able to support these institutions by leaving free copies to scholars? And that will allow us to kind of, broaden the field of our reach as special collections, because most people don't even know special collections exist.
That's true.
I mean, I generally teach basic paleography or basic manuscript reading to students, and they have no idea where they can find the originals, where they can find the pieces to exercise themselves. And most libraries are thinking, if we put them out in the open, we're going to lose money. And my idea is, no, you're not. You're probably going to gain money. And so, I think National Library of Scotland is an example.
Okay, right? Joe, any
thanks,
thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Alexander.
I'm sorry to be so crass, right? I've been horrible.
It's a really important question, and I think it's probably fair to say there are different approaches in different organisations around the world. I mean, in my own organisation, we do digitise and make material available freely, and that's very much a principle that we try to follow. However, what I would say is that everything does cost money, and if you're going to digitize a manuscript, it has to be paid for somehow. And we at the National Library of Scotland have the capacity to do that, thanks to the funding that we get from the Scottish Government. But for many organisations, that is deeply problematic. And I mean, this is much to do with the wider funding and support of the information sector. And yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned in the presentation that there's certainly been a trend in archives to get digitization done through commercial partnerships. And then if you're researching your family history, you have to pay a certain amount of money to download a will, and that then you get sort of trapped in this loop. But it's not something that is easily solved, and I think the more people can talk about this, and get these issues out in the open, that is what's going to move to longer term change.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Thanks,
Sorry.
Joe. Can we move on to Julie Garden? Can we move on to Julie Garden, please? We've got quite a few to get through now. Julie asks, would you like to expand on collecting for the future, Joe?
I'd love to. How long have you got?
About 3 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute.
Yeah, so I mean, special collections is all about building the collections in many ways. And it's certainly, when I was a special collections librarian, it's one of the real thrills of the job. Going to the book fairs or going to a house where somebody wants to give you their collection. It is very much the lifeblood of special collections to keep new material coming in. It keeps the existing collections alive. So I mean, collecting for the future. Well, I mean, I think the big thing is to keep that collecting going, but also to widen the scope. So I mean, special collections libraries are getting braver, going out into more diverse material, taking a few more risks, the kind of people they talk to. And I think they just need to keep pushing that, getting into communities that might not have given material to special collections in the past. So moving away from perhaps just the very core traditional incunabular early printed books, and getting out perhaps into that more ephemeral material, the stuff that's really complex, that's really rare. That's where the big opportunities are for special collections, and of course in the digital. So yeah, I mean, the special collecting for the future, just keep doing it and keep doing more of it.
Okay, thanks. Georgina Ziegler has asked, what was the novel that Joe mentioned before, the Robert Harris one? And I think Andrew's answered it, The Second Sleep.
So I mentioned Richard Jefferies' After London, published in 1885. That was the first one I mentioned, which is a jolly good read.
Okay, Mike Widener. I think this might be a comment, but perhaps you could tell us what you think of it. You could discuss the use of rare books as a powerful instructional technology, much more powerful than a PowerPoint presentation, as you've just demonstrated, really.
You could. I mean, the problem is, how do you get that to so many people? I love doing show and tells, getting people to touch books and handle them, and it's incredibly rewarding. But you can only reach a handful of people at a time. And how do you bridge the gap between those rich in-person experiences and reaching the millions of people that you can do digitally? I don't think we have the solution to that yet.
Okay. They're flooding in now, so we better get a move on. Stephen Hall asks, will there be a point, oh, this is nitty gritty, will there be a point where the cost of a librarian staff member will be weighed against the cost of purchasing more special collection?
Well, I sincerely hope not. I mean, all organisations that have special collections have to make decisions about where they put their resource. But I mean, at the end of the day, if you haven't got staff, you can't do anything with the content. And so, if you spend millions of pounds buying rare books and you've got nobody to catalogue them, you might as well have poured your money down the drain.
Graham Lyle, is there any movement of material going in or out of special collections? Churning? Is there anything that gets demoted and found no longer worthy of remaining in a collection, or a thinning out of a collection? You might have mentioned such points.
I think the simple answer is yes. I mean, it varies very much from special collection to special collection. And people perhaps don't talk about this very openly, because generally special collections do have a commitment to long-term preservation. But I mean, the reality is that, yes, many special collections do withdraw material, deaccession it, or transfer it elsewhere if they can find a better home for it. and you know, there is a market that is living. So yeah, that activity goes on, and I think that will probably be an increased feature of special collections over the next few years, as I suggested, there's more merging of institutions, more collections coming together, perhaps more stuff coming out. At the moment, for example, the National Library of New Zealand is doing a big deaccessioning activity. They're withdrawing, I think, about 600,000 books. And I'm pleased to say that some of those are actually coming to the National Library of Scotland, because they've got material and we're acquiring them. So yeah, it's not a bad thing. You know, it sometimes means that books end up in a better special collection than they were in originally.
Okay, John Scally, what about the possibility of the world rotating back to the physical, including special collections? Digital is still very new and has scarcely settled.
Yes, well, thank you, John. I agree, and I mean we do all talk about, you know, the long-term trajectory towards the digital, and we all, I think, generally assume that it's going to keep going, but we don't know. And I mean, as I suggested, it's entirely possible that, you know, we may, over the next 10, 20 years, have disruptive events that do throw us back. And yeah, I mean, if the lights go out, well, special collections will still be there. And, you know, special collections books don't rely on electricity, they don't rely on data. You know, they will still be usable as long as there are people to use them. So yeah, I mean, I hope we don't end up in that situation, but if it does, special collections will be one of the things that keep going.
Okay, we're just going to do two more, Joe, if that's okay with you. I know you've had a really long, tiring day. It's about time you put your feet up. Graham Hawley asks, I think that some of the special collections of the future are likely to be personal web archive collections of things like Yahoo GeoCities sites or blockchain books, recreating provenance in the digital age, where private technical experts were ahead of libraries in this collecting game. That has implications for the relationships that libraries and archives need to cultivate. I guess you need another hour to answer that, but just, you know, quickly.
Absolutely. You know, I mean, these things are really important, and they're being lost at the moment. I mean, this is, I know, one of the things that Graham and I both worry about. You know, these complex digital objects are being created, and at the moment, you know, because we don't have the skills, or we don't even know about them, these things are disappearing as we speak. So yeah, absolutely, this is going to be a key field for special collections going forward.
Thanks. And finally, from Elizabeth Lawrence, have you any thoughts on the growth of the popularity of special collections as part of popular cultural heritage, the difference between it being exclusive and excluding to becoming everyone's heritage? It's a good one to finish with.
Yes, absolutely. And I think special collections are rightly headed in that direction. And they have, I mean, even though they still have this word special, they are making real efforts to move away from being exclusive. I think there's still a long way to go. And you know, the digital approaches can help to break down some of those barriers. But I think one of the big challenges for special collections is to reach more people, but without getting trapped into telling simple, simplistic and inaccurate stories. So somehow representing, you know, the complexity and the depth of the stories that are really contained within those collections. That is really, really difficult, and that's why, you know, special collections are going to need, you know, such, you know, amazing staff as they go forward.
Well, I think we'll wind up there. Thank you so much, Joe, on behalf of everybody, for your time, your commitment, your knowledge, and your forecasting skills. And I'd like everybody to give you a virtual round of applause for such a virtuoso performance. I've just got a couple of notices before you switch off your Zoom feeds. The first one is on the screen there. It's about our next meeting, which is scheduled for the 29th of April. When, after today's glimpse into the future, Louise Gardner is going to take us back into the distant past with a talk entitled Royal Correspondence in Late 14th Century England, the Royal Letter Book, which is one of the manuscripts in one of the special collections at this one at the University of Edinburgh Library. And secondly, advance notice that the talk we had planned for the 13th of May, we've had to cancel it because sadly Tony Velikova, who was due to give it, has withdrawn because she's been unable to complete her research, given, of course, that libraries and so on are closed during the lockdown. But we've got a replacement. We're very grateful to Fiona Mossman for stepping into the breach, and she's going to deliver a paper entitled Scripted Summits, Book History, Mountaineering and the Experiences of Janet Adams Smith, 1905 to 1999. That sounds really interesting. Okay, so finally from me, I'd like to wish you a happy lockdown Easter break, even though it promises to be just like every other day at the moment. And thank you for joining us, and we'll see you at the next meeting. Good night.